For some context, I'm a 34-year-old female. This happened to me when I was 27. I worked full-time as a researcher at a university, which is where these encounters took place. Now, I'm not a professor or anything, and because of my age at the time, I could have easily been mistaken for just another student wandering around campus. On some days when the weather was nice, I would prefer to spend my lunch hour strolling about the university grounds outside or sitting underneath a shady tree on a bench. I was enjoying the time. I was not just sitting in a cramped corner of a lab somewhere. On one of these days, I was sitting on a bench, enjoying the fresh air, and a male student walking by asked if he could sit next to me. I'm pretty shy and kind of an awkward person, so even though I really would have preferred to enjoy my break alone, I said sure. Why not? The guy initiated simple conversation to which I obliged, but I was careful not to be too forthcoming. He mentioned he had seen which departmental building I came from, which was slightly weird to me. I had never seen this guy before in my life, so why would he take note of me in particular? I pushed the thought from my mind, though. After all, the weather had been quite decent lately, and I had spent nearly all my lunch hours for the past week outside. He asked if I was studying within the mansion department, to which I told him I was not a student. I actually worked there. He told me he was an engineering student and then followed up with asking me out for coffee sometime. I apologized and told them I would have to decline. We parted ways after that, and I assumed I would never see him again. About a week or two went by. I was spending another lunch hour outside on campus, sitting on a different bench in a corner somewhere. Seemingly out of nowhere, the same guy from before asked if he could sit next to me once again. Admittedly, I can't quite remember what we talked about. My mind was reeling a bit at the chances of this exact same thing happening again. I was rather uncomfortable with having to turn this guy down a second time. Sure enough, he asked me once again if we could go out for coffee sometime. I apologized and told them I had a boyfriend and would not be meeting him anywhere again. He left without saying much else. After, I was feeling rather anxious now, but it hadn't reached a level where I had to be too concerned about it. A few days later, I just finished work and was leaving the building to walk to where I had parked my car. The university charged a fortune for parking passes, even if you were employed by them. I had always opted for the free street parking about a 10-minute walk away instead. My walking route would take me down several quiet residential streets with minimal car traffic. Even pedestrian traffic was pretty sparse on the busiest of days. It wasn't until I was about halfway to my car, down one of these quiet back roads, when I noticed someone was walking directly across the street from me, keeping a few paces behind me. I'd only noticed them out of my peripheral vision. I didn't want to flat out turn and stare to let them know I'd noticed them. Besides, it wasn't too uncommon to see someone else walking. I was just trying to be aware of my surroundings when walking the streets alone. I had to make a few turns coming up anyway. A chance they would be going the exact same way as me was very slim, but all the same. He did. He made every single turn I did, still keeping pace directly across from me, a few steps behind. I didn't want to look at whoever this was. I didn't want him to know I was aware of what he was doing. I quickened my pace a bit and was approaching the first of two busier streets before I would reach my car. His pace quickened to keep an exact match with me. That was the moment I began to panic. I was sure he was following me. After that, I started to full-out jog to cross the first of the busier streets. He started to run to keep up behind me and was now on the same side of the street I was. I was nearly to my car, but I had to cross that last busy street and go about 100 meters before I would be there. It was crossing that street that worried me the most. I often had to stop and wait a good minute or so before it was clear enough to do so. If that were the case this time, it would catch up to me easily. Somehow, as if the stars had aligned for me, as soon as I made it running to the busy street, I had a large gap to cross. I booked it as fast as I could, finally turning around once I'd made it through. I wanted to scream at the man who had been pursuing me. It was him. I could have suspected at first, but now it was confirmed. It was that same engineering student I had turned down for coffee those times. "Why are you following me?" I yelled at him from across the busy street. "I just want to talk to you," he yelled back. I didn't even answer him. I mean, the answer was obvious from the start. I was certainly never going to give my time to someone who was following behind me and chased me for an entire kilometer. I kept moving quickly to my car, determined to get the hell out of there. I didn't even care if he saw which one was mine. It seemed he had given up on following me and didn't try to cross the road after. To my relief, I got home and broke down. I mean, worse things have happened to other people, no doubt. And he didn't have the chance to harm me, fortunately. But I was very shaken. I had some anxieties walking to and from work after. It wasn't long before a coworker and I would walk most of the distance back to our cars together. I even changed where I started parking for a time. A few weeks passed by since the incident, and I had not seen that particular guy around campus at all. I had started spending my lunches in the lab instead of outside. Occasionally, I would go to the student center to buy lunch instead. There's one particular day the food court was packed almost shoulder to shoulder. I was standing in line at a burger stall when I heard a guy trying to get someone's attention through the crowd. I looked up. There he was waving to me, trying to push his way through the mass of people. I panicked. I started to cause a scene and yelled at him to leave me alone. His face dropped as people began to stare at him, and he slinked back into the sea of students. My heart was pounding, and I was shaking. I don't even remember if I ended up actually getting my food after. I went back to work, and from then on, I was even more focused on my surroundings than I ever was before. It's been 5 or 6 years since then, and I still do work there. I'm relieved to say I never saw him again after the food court, and I haven't had any other harrowing accounts on campus. I'm diligent about being aware of my surroundings, especially when I have to walk to and from alone. The funniest thing is the guy never even told me his name, so I couldn't report an incident to the campus police or anything. All in all, I'm just glad I never saw him again. I can only hope he didn't do this to anyone else before or after me. My wife and I have a really unique setup in our house. My wife is a strict vegetarian, you see, but I wouldn't give up meat to save my life. She also really doesn't drink, and I'd like to have some beer every day personally when I get home from work. She's so strict about this that she actually worries about our food and stuff getting mixed together. It's sort of obsessive, compulsive, I guess. So in order to not have her worrying about it, I let her use the kitchen refrigerator for her food and bought a second smaller refrigerator for my food and beer. I kept this one out in the garage. I know it must seem sort of weird for a husband and wife to have their food completely separate from one another, but I never really thought about it that much. We didn't often have meals together. Rather, we just eat whenever we felt like it, really. For my wife, at least, it was much less of a social thing than it was simply a necessity. Plus, I like to eat much later into the night, and she wouldn't touch a single thing after 7 p.m. For most nights, I got used to going over to the garage door and didn't even bother turning the light on. I had to use the hallway light to see my way over to the refrigerator. Open it up quickly, grab what I wanted, and then rush back into the house. I would do this over and over. I didn't actually use the 2-car garage for much of anything else. My wife and I parked our cars in the driveway mostly. I did have 2 old motorcycles that I didn't really use anymore, and a broken down Ford Mustang along with some old boxes stored in there. Though one night my wife had already had her food, and she decided to go to bed pretty early. It was about 10 o'clock when I realized I really hadn't had anything to eat again. This was not too out of the ordinary, since my wife and I didn't really eat together. We both often forget to eat until it was really late at night. I had been watching some scary movies on Netflix since my wife was in bed. She didn't like that type of stuff. I got up and went over to the garage door, opened it, and went to grab some food. I can't quite explain it well, but for some reason, all of a sudden, I felt very uneasy as I entered the garage. I had never felt that way before, but it was a very overwhelming, scared feeling. I chalked it up to the fact that maybe the movie I was watching was scarier than I'd initially thought. I quickly grabbed what I wanted, slammed the door shut, and made my way back into the home. I fixed myself the food, climbed into my chair, and started to watch my movie again. When it was over, I wasn't really that tired yet though. I was enjoying myself as well, so I decided to go ahead and pop another one in. First though, I needed to grab myself a couple of beers with which to enhance my enjoyment of this upcoming film. On my way over to the garage, I began to remember my apprehension from before. It was odd because I watch these sorts of things all the time. I usually watch them alone as well. It had been years since I'd actually gotten freaked out by one. I tried to be bold and just go about my business as usual. When I got to the garage door, I tried to psych myself up. I told myself I was not going to chicken out. I opened the door, left it open, and cautiously made my way over to the refrigerator while I was holding the door open. Though I began to get extremely freaked out again. I couldn't quite explain why I felt so timid at the time. I was hyper aware of what was going on around me. I got worked up thinking someone must be in the garage with me. Surely it was just a movie making me scared. Though it was worse when the garage door to the house slowly shut behind me. Rather than grab my beer, I jogged over to the door and quickly flipped on the garage light. The garage lights were extremely bright, and since I never used them, they immediately hurt my eyes in the darkness. I groaned and simultaneously heard another groan. I rubbed my eyes quickly and looked over at the far side of the garage. I couldn't see anything, and at first, I thought it must be my imagination. I walked over and looked around. I looked behind the boxes, behind the car, but I didn't see anyone. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, but once I turned around, I happened to glance into the back seat of the Mustang. I jumped in place when I saw someone lying in the back seat of the car, crouched down and trying to avoid being seen. This time, I sprinted over to the door. I rushed into the house, slammed it behind me, and locked the door shut. The garage door opener was inside the home, so whoever was in there could not get out. I called the police. They came and got the guy out. They found a box cutter and a razor blade on him. But that's not the scariest part. The part that got me the worst was that the man had apparently broken into my garage 2 months beforehand. He had been living in there the entire time, surviving off food from my refrigerator every single night. I had walked into the garage without turning the light on. The man had been in there with me. That has been hard to get over. There's nothing worse than taking a wrong turn. Well, let me rephrase that quickly. There's nothing worse than taking a turn deliberately, only to realize much later on that it was the wrong turn. I was driving home from work one night. I always get bored to death, going the same way over and over again. So occasionally, just to keep my mind focused, I try to take a new road and find my way home. I live in a pretty rural area too, so sometimes this can get me pretty lost. This time was definitely one of those. For people who haven't ever really lived out in the country, you might not know how positively frightening it can be to drive down an old dirt road through the hills with no streetlights, surrounded on all sides by trees in the dark. You can't drive particularly fast either, because there are plenty of sharp turns. The road I turned down that night in question had another problem as well. After a very short time on it, it quickly narrowed down to only a single lane. This made the ride even more difficult because it gave me only 2 options. Drive in reverse and get back to the road I'd been driving on, or drive forward and eventually turn around in whatever driveway this road led to. I wish I could explain this in a way that truly conveyed how frightening it was. It was pitch black. My headlights only lit up a small portion of the area in front of me. Everything only slightly up ahead was completely dark, and everything behind me and to the sides was pitch black. I had to drive extremely slowly for fear of running into something dangerous. After much driving, the road took a sudden turn, and my worst fear became true. This did not lead to a driveway. Instead, it turned right into a big solid metal barrier gate. Like I said, there wasn't a driveway behind it either. I could see there was room beyond the gate to turn my car around a bit. So completely scared out of my wits, I pulled up close to the gate. I got out and of course left my door open and walked slowly over to it. I quickly grabbed it and swung it open. Then I rushed back to my car and slammed the door. It gave me just enough space to drive through. I slowly drove in, turned around, and pulled past the gate. At that point, I should have just driven off and left the barrier gate open. But I'm the sort of person who just can't do that. I mean, I'd opened the gate in the first place. I felt obligated to close it as I left. I looked behind my car just to make sure, and I could barely see anything behind me. The taillights created a small amount of light, but it was not nearly enough to be able to see what I was doing. I didn't have a flashlight either. I should have left, but instead I opened the door of my car. I thought by leaving the door open, I might get more light. Yet it didn't really help. Slowly, I began to walk back to the gate. I was practically blind. I kept my hand on my car as I moved back. When my eyes adjusted, they did adjust enough for me to see the gate. So I reached out and put my hand on it, prepared to pull it closed. No sooner than I had touched the gate, though, I heard very clearly, as if someone was right behind me, speaking directly into my ear. "Get the hell out of here now." I didn't bother with the gate. My fight or flight kicked in for the first time in my life. I ran to the car, when, without even having any control over my body, I jumped in, slammed, and locked the door and hit the gas. As I started driving, I was much more scared than I had even been outside the car. My mind began playing tricks on me, and I began to wonder if someone was hiding in my back seat or something, and I was too scared to look. Though I kept expecting someone to jump out in front of my car at any second, but I never stopped. I kept on driving until I got back to the main road. I turned down it and took the more safe way home. Of course, by the time I arrived, I looked in the back seat. No one was waiting there. Thankfully, my uncle has always told me to keep out of the hills. He said there were some really unpleasant, unsavory, and very dangerous people out there. I used to think he was full of it, but I don't think that much anymore.